for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel.
So here, Magi, you probably know this, but Magi, magician, magic, the same root, really. Wise men from Chaldea, probably Iraq, for what it's worth, somewhere out there. There's a tradition that says it was an Indian there, but who knows. So these guys come and they say, hey, we saw, our astrology told us that there's a king that is born. And where is this king to be born? And they go back to Micah and they quote this and they say, well, clearly we know that the king, the ultimate king of the Jews, is going to be born in Bethlehem. So they're putting all this together. For us, it seems obvious, but it's a hard move for them to make. He just shows up and says, there's a king born, where's the king? And they go back to this old prophetic book and say, oh, he has to be from Bethlehem. Here's a little side note. Verse 6, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah. What's the next phrase in your translation? Okay, by no means least. Flip back to Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. And what do you read there?
Though you are small among the clans.
Okay, so it's different. Does anyone have a translation where the two phrases are the same? NLT might do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have NLT, it's different.
It's different?
Mhm.
Okay, it's different. Very good.
There
So-
is a note in the NIV that says, where it says clans in Micah, could be or rulers.
Or rulers, yeah. So here's another interesting side note. Many times when the New Testament pulls out bits from the Old Testament, you go and look at the Old Testament, it says something slightly different. I wonder if you noticed that. Part of it is there's a Septuagint that I talked about months ago, you've probably forgotten, but there's a translation that came into being around, the time of Jesus, of the Old Testament, which is written in Hebrew primarily, into Greek, because Greek was the lingua franca at the time. Everyone spoke Greek. So there was a translation from Hebrew to Greek, and the translation is not a very good translation. It's kind of wooden. It's kind of what you would do if you had this Hebrew Old Testament, and then you had a very simple dictionary of Hebrew to Greek words. So you just kind of put those words in. So if you read the Septuagint in Greek, the Greek is choppy and fluid, feels like a foreign language to the ones who are doing it. And frequently the translation is slightly different. The word is slightly different. In fact, here's a place where it's quite different. But the New Testament writers, and Jesus included, Paul, very significantly quoted from the Septuagint. They didn't quote from the Hebrew. They quote, that's what we've got here. They quote from the Septuagint. So they quote from a translation that is slightly different than what was actually written. What do you think about that? You comfortable with that?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. That's a great answer. Say more.
I'm comfortable with it because they're trying to use the language of the day, and so that it has some limitations and whatever else. But if you continue down that path, it would seem like it would completely unravel at some point and not mean anything that it meant before.
Yeah.
So I am, but probably only for another couple hundred years.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's an excellent analysis. So that's a side note. Just keep that in mind as we go through some of this stuff. So that's how prophecy works. So the prophet Micah is inspired by God to say something that is going to come. He has no real idea of exactly how it's going to be fulfilled, but he says it. And then much later something happens, and then we recognize it as the fulfillment of prophecy. Right? So that's prophecy. There's something clearly that's said, and then something happens, and the prophet saying it knows that something is going to come to fulfill what he just said. That's prophecy. Prefiguring, which is the second concept that you need to keep in mind, is quite different. Prefiguring is someone reading backwards into something that happened before in a way that makes a connection between this and that. You're reading backwards into it. In fact, the event or the person or the words that were first spoken, they may not have had any idea that this is going to prefigure anything else. They might just have been talking about stuff right there. But then someone much later reading that connects that with an event going on here. Does that make you a little uncomfortable? Yeah, it should. Good. Okay. The trouble is the New Testament is filled with that stuff. So we've got to find a way to understand what's going on. Let's look at an example. Flip to Psalm 22. Someone read Psalm 22 from verse 1 to 18.
Did you say 18?
Yep.
They divide my
No,
garment.
from verse 1, all the way from verse 1 to 18.
Yeah, you just bit off a big piece.
I thought you said just 18.
You can wait for somebody else to do the first 17 and then we can.
Oh yeah, I'm all ready for 18 whenever we get there.
What's that?
All right, so my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for my dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Thank you. Intense stuff, huh? So I have two questions for you. Who is talking and what is he talking about?
It's talking about the crucifixion of Christ.
You think? You think that's what he had in mind? It seems obvious, right?
It does.
Yeah, we make jump because we know the crucifixion. But this, it says the Psalm of David. If you look at the... So was David sort of saying, okay, I'm going to say these things, and then, 1,000 years later, Jesus is going to use it? I can't see that.
Doubt it.
Yeah, I highly doubt that. It certainly seems like he is talking about his own experience, but something's going on. Some terrible thing is going on. Who knows what? The problem is then, you see all this stuff. My God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, what a familiar and intense. So that feels like, okay, there's a Jesus bit there, but then suddenly you go to I cry by day, but you don't answer, and by night, but I find no rest. I don't know. Did Jesus feel that? Possibly. Then I'm a worm and not a man. Scorned by mankind. Suddenly we have that phrase, we know, despised. Okay, that seems familiar. All the same, he mocked me. Yep, they did that. They wagged their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him. They said that about him on the cross. But then suddenly he says, yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breast. And now we're like, wait, Jesus had to learn to trust God? That kind of splinters our cranium a little bit. And then I'm poured out like water, all my bones are of joint, my heart is like wax. This describes crucifixion, you know? For dogs encompass me, accompany, they pierced my hands and feet. What would that even mean in a world where crucifixion didn't exist? This is 1,000 years before. The Romans started using crucifixion maybe 300 years before Jesus. So 700 years before crucifixion became an issue. He's describing it, sort of. But it's his experience. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast their lots. So we've got this is a difficult issue here. What exactly is going on? Is this prophetic of Jesus? If it's prophetic of Jesus, then what about the other bits? Do they also speak of something that we haven't made the connections to? So what we typically say is this is prefiguring. Something happened back then, and then something happens much later, and the person, and I have little doubt in my mind, this is just speculation, I have little doubt that Jesus had the psalm in his heart on the cross. You know, the psalm gives him words to speak, and there's a shock of recognition for him that what was spoken of there is, he's experiencing bits of it. If you read the Gospels carefully, you'll find in the last week of his life, his mind was frequently in Jeremiah, Isaiah, and the Psalms. There's lots of resonances there in the last week or so. And that we can relate to. You know, we are in difficult circumstances, and then bits of the Bible come back to our hearts, and we start entering into the same way Jesus was right there. It's not prophetic. It's not prophetic, because prophetic means then we'd have to make the statement that David knew that he was going to. All this is a judgment call. It's like we're making a decision. You might disagree with me, and that's totally fine. I'm just saying I don't think this is prophetic. This is prefiguring. Let's look at another example. Flip to Numbers chapter 20.
I'm sorry, is the
Yes.
text prefiguring, or are we prefiguring when we interpret the text this way?
Great question. We are asserting that that's a prefiguration when we read it that way.
Okay.
Someone else, I'm going to come to this a little bit. Someone else will come along and say that he's reading into it. That's not there in the text. He's making it up. It's a legitimate concern. We have to look at that. Numbers 20, verse 11. Just verse 11.
If it's just one verse, then I'll read it.
Okay, you got it.
I was just waiting for a short thing to read. Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, so the entire community and their livestock drank their fill.
So you have a picture in your mind? These people in the desert, there's no water, and they're complaining, and God tells Moses, take your rod, hit that rock. He does that, and water comes flooding out of that rock. Now flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And read verse 3 and 4. Read from verse 1 to 4.
10 what?
10, 1 to 4. This is Paul.
For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ.
You go, whoa, wait. How did he get there, right? I mean, we just read that, and as far as I can tell, this rock wasn't moving anywhere. It seemed like this rock there. He whacked the rock, he got water. That's all we know from the story. And I'm not hiding anything from you. That's all we've got. There's nothing hidden. Now Paul takes that, now he talks about a rock that moved along with them. And then he says that rock was Christ. Where did he come up with that?
To me, this seems like an example of how you have the Old Testament law, which was kind of black and white, and then the New Testament, Jesus and the New Testament writers kind of expanded that to look more at the intent. So to me, this is just kind of an example of that,
Yeah.
of looking that, yes, God provided then,
Right.
but it was more than just that physical
Uh,
water that He
yeah.
provided. But
Yeah, I
it's-
like that a lot. So he's saying there's more to this story than we thought there was. And he can only say that in the light of Jesus. So really what is going on, when you're putting your finger on it, is that these New Testament guys from the Gospel writers onward are reading the entire Old Testament in the light of Jesus. So Jesus showed up, and now they've got to go back and read the whole thing with this new data in mind. If you were Jewish, you'd resent that a lot. The best analogy I can give you is like the Book of Mormon. We have a Mormon looking at our Bible and interpreting it through their extra revelation. That makes you go, wait, that's not what it means at all. But he's confident that it is. They're doing the same kind of thing here. So Jesus becomes that lens through which now they read the entire Old Testament. That's prefiguring. Okay, and we're not comfortable with that. And it's good that we're not comfortable with that, because there are many risks with this kind of reading. And I wanted to talk about that today. That's what we're going to spend our time thinking through. But on the other hand, you've got to get used to working with a text like this, because the New Testament writers do this kind of stuff. They do. So we've got to figure out getting there.
Does the Quran do the same thing?
The Quran, bits of it. Okay, that's a great question.
Sorry.
So I think here's my theory on Muhammad for what it's worth. I think this guy was a trader, right? He traveled in caravans throughout the Middle East, trading for 15 years before the first revelation hit him. He was about 40 when it hit him.
Oh, he was a trader.
He was a trader.
I thought he was a traitor.
Oh, a trader. Yeah, I don't know. He's mocking me. He mocks me all the time.
No. There's
Okay.
no way to tell apart, but when you first said it, I
Okay.
thought, oh, he was a trader?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, he was a trader.
Merchant.
Merchant! Mocking me. Yeah.
No, I thought you were going to tell me.
And he lived in a very polytheistic world, and so I think he ran into Jews and Christians on the way, and picked up a lot of Jewish and Christian thinking, partial, not really complete, because this is 600 AD, and no one's got a copy of the Bible in the back pocket. It's all oral. There's bits and pieces you've heard and traditions. And so then when you come back, he has two chunks of, the Quran really comes from Arabic Hebrew word saying recite. You speak, God speaks, that's the idea. And so there are two chunks of the Quran. The first is when he's still in Mecca. And then the people throw him out of Mecca, he flees to Medina, and then the second big chunk comes from those years. The first chunk, if you read it, it very much sounds like someone who's picked up ideas of Jewish and Christian monotheism, and he's trying to draw people back to this monotheism. Speaks very highly of Jesus, gets the Trinity confused, he sticks Mary in the Trinity. So you can tell he's hearing some ideas, but it's kind of, hodgepodge. But the ideas in it are familiar to us. We think, shoot, this is like a weird little sect of Christianity. And then he faces opposition, and as he faces opposition both from Jews and Christians and everybody else, then the whole tenor of the Quran changes to, this is the true revelation. Those guys are all wrong. I'm the final prophet. So the first bit, if you read it, you'd feel a lot of prefiguring. The second bit, sometimes it just feels like someone's just high, man. But then there are bits of the Bible that sound like that too. So, it's just like, what are you talking about? It's just really weird. And the Quran is arranged not chronologically, but by the length of the chapter. So it really blows your mind when you read through it, because it's like one chapter from here, another chapter from there. So it's
And then there was a huge effort of editing
Oh, totally.
after Muhammad
Totally.
passed away.
Totally.
And they don't hide the fact that,
Yeah, yeah.
that it was edited. So it's a completely different
It is.
way of producing
Yeah,
a text.
it is.
Although there's redacting
It
in
is,
here too.
yeah.
So.
I mean, there's a side note, but you've got to read the Quran charitably, because we live in a context right now where there's intense animosity and suspicion, and so if someone read the Bible, they could poke at us like you would not believe. And the book of Joshua has more blood than any other book I know of anywhere. And we tend to say, well, because of Jesus, turn the other cheek and all that. But to this day, there are parts of the U.S. military that derive their justification from the Bible, from the New Testament. It's true. So we've got to read the Quran with charity, saying, hey, here's context. There's some context to this, while yet not diminishing the fact that there are things that are just nuts. There's no way to go around it, but that's a whole nother.
If you take a high look at the Old Testament,
Yeah.
the justification for things that you see in Paul or that Jesus does with the text is there because the story of redemption is there.
And we're going to get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. So anyway, so this back to this prefigured reading. It's very uncomfortable for us because it feels like we're putting back into it what wasn't there in the first place. That's the basic concern we got. But then now if we flip back to John chapter 5 verse 46, which is where we started. If you believe Moses, you believe me, for he wrote of me. Now we have fresh insight what Jesus might be talking about. So now we might say maybe Jesus isn't talking about prophetic stuff, though I can think of at least two places that seem, Genesis 3:15. There's a sense of the seed that is going to come, that's going to crush the serpent. And because God is saying it, I have confidence that it's prophetic. He knows, in that sense. Or there's a bit in Deuteronomy that talks about a prophet that's going to come greater than Moses, like Moses, but greater than him. I cannot think. There are a couple of places like that, it seems sort of clear. But I think Jesus is saying I was prefigured in Moses. So you go back and read Moses through seeing me, and you'll see me all over the place. For instance, flip to Exodus 12. Just read from verse 1 through 13.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast it over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. And do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt.
What's he talking about?
Talking about Passover, right?
Passover, yeah.
Okay.
Pretty obvious. Yeah. I got no trick questions here. I mean, really, I'm not trying to catch you on anything. I'm just trying to read it. Okay, so don't think I have hidden something in my head. I'm not going to say, aha, you are out of here. No, no. All right. So it's clearly the Passover. Obviously the Passover. What if I said to you, but he's talking about Jesus? Would you be comfortable with that if I said that? He's talking about Jesus.
Not without explanation.
Great, not without explanation. I love that answer. You've got to make a case for it, right? Now, in Hebrews, he does say Christ our Passover sacrifice for us. But how do you make that connection? So you can say, well, the Holy Spirit told him to make that connection, which is true and wonderful and good. And yet it has to be more than that. There has to be some way of saying, this is why. It can't be just arbitrary. So this is prefigural. What happened there? A lamb that was sacrificed to save them. Then there's a lamb sacrificed to save us. And so then that's prefigural stuff. Here's another one, Numbers 21. This is just a handful of verses. Numbers 21, 4 through 9.
Through 9?
Yep.
Then the people of Israel set out from Mount Hor, taking the road to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people grew impatient with the long journey, and they began to speak against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die here in the wilderness?" they complained. "There's nothing to eat here and nothing to drink, and we hate this horrible manna." So the Lord sent poisonous
You learned
snakes among the
something?
people.
We hate this horrible manna.
Sounds like my kids.
Yeah.
Are we
And-
there yet?
I have to use the bathroom. So the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and many were bitten and died. Then the people came to Moses and cried out, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take away the snakes." So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord told him, "Make a replica of poisonous snake and attach it to a pole. All who are bitten will live if they simply look at it." So Moses made a snake out of bronze and attached it to a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by a snake could look at the bronze snake and be healed.
Great. You have the picture in your mind? It's a weird little story.
It is a weird story.
It's a weird story. These people are just complaining, so he sends poisonous snakes among them. The Lord does
Let me
that.
tell you a quick snake
Okay.
story.
Yeah, okay.
Were you there when we were driving down to the Uganda River?
Yeah.
When we were driving down that little trail and the trees were like
Uh-huh.
hitting the windows, and Pastor Dan goes, "Hey, you should roll the windows up." And we're like, "Okay, 'cause it's like beastly hot." We're why? Well, you see that there's snakes in those trees, and
gosh.
they called them they were the black mamba and the green mamba.
Oh, that's bad.
Yeah, he said, and he said the how did he say it? It was like, he said something like, the green ones are poisonous, and the black ones jump. Like the green ones are poisonous, and the black ones like jump in, and we're like, oh, so the black ones aren't poisonous? Oh no, those are poisonous too, but they jump and they're poisonous.
Yeah. Yep, these are mambas, man. So the people are impatient, and the Lord sends snakes among them. It's kind of a wild thing to do. And the people come to Moses and say, "We have sinned. Sorry. Pray to the Lord. Take away these serpents that are hanging on to my ankle here." And so Moses prayed, and then the Lord says, "Hey, make a serpent out of bronze and then stick it up there. And then if someone looks at it, they live." It's all very bizarre stuff. If you read this in the Quran, you'd go, "Yeah, that was Muslim people, you know." But it happens. And so Moses makes this bronze serpent and puts it on a pole, sticks it out in the middle of the camp, and if a snake bit you, you look at the pole and you are healed. Okay. So, supposing I said to you that serpent is Jesus, how do you feel about that?
The bronze serpent on the
The
pole.
bronze serpent, not the
Not the jumping black
not the
mamba.
jumping black mambas. Yeah. If I said the snake that was lifted up, that's Jesus. How do you feel about that?
I would hope so.
You'd hope so. Okay, so you can see the connection, right? And yet, it's the same word that's used for the tempter in Genesis. Right? And we would not make that connection except Jesus did himself. In John 3, he says, John 3, verse 14 and 15, he says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." Again, this is not prophecy, but this is prefiguring. Can you see the difference? I don't think Moses had any idea that this is Jesus. He just stuck the snake up and hoped for the best.
The thing about prefiguring is that it's an actual event
Yep.
that happened, and there are purposes that apply to the immediate people, and they were being taught something, and it's all occurring while they're sitting there under the cloud. It's
Right.
the Shekinah is above them while this whole thing happened. So it's the context is pretty wild,
It is.
but it meant something for them,
Right.
and then we see a bigger or
Yeah. Yeah, we're doing
Other
that. That's the
meaning.
critical part. We are the ones making that connection. Yeah.
How important is this, the nuance between the
It's very
prophecy
important
and
because
prefiguring?
we tend to read too many things as prophetic, and then we struggle with trying to make sense out of it. How exactly what's that connection? And it blows your mind as to the connection. But if you say no, this is prefiguring. We made a subjective decision to make that connection. Then it's open to more discussion than a prophetic. With Micah, it's pretty clear. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what happened. Well, there's a very clear connection. Part of it is you've got to read everything from the angle of how do I explain this to my friend who doesn't have my faith? How can I help him see that this makes sense? And if I come into it saying, well, you're just going to have to trust me, well, you know how that goes, right? So I'm arguing for thoughtful reading of the Bible so that we can explain it, we can communicate it.
But didn't the New Testament almost have to do this? Because if the writers were trying to convince the Jewish people that, hey, this is what it all said,
Yeah,
but this is really what it means because this is, Jesus came,
yeah.
it would almost have to do that, wouldn't it?
I think you're right. I would change one word. Instead of but, I would say and. So the first hearers of Jesus they know the Old Testament. They live in a world totally shaped by the Old Testament for 2,000 years. That's their culture. It's their religion. It's everything for them. And these guys are coming to them saying, you know all of that? Well, this is it. All of that, as Todd said, all of that is pointing to this. So it's a fulfillment. It's not a contrast. It's not like you thought it meant that, but really it means this. No. This is what we knew, but this is what it was all pointing to. So that's the force of their argument. In fact, if you read many of the sermons that Paul or Peter gave to the Jews, we'll read them and go, huh, what? But when you put it in the context of all that they have in their world, it just slots right in. So I think that's very perceptive. The Western Church has been very uncomfortable with this kind of reading for about 500 years. If you go to the Greek Orthodox Church, if you go to the Coptic Church, if you go to some of the other branches of the church, they're quite comfortable with this kind of stuff. In fact, they do so much of it, it kind of weirds you out a little bit. This is that and that's this. But the Western Church, it's been very difficult, mostly because the Renaissance, part of what happened with the Reformation in particular, was that because the Catholic Church had used this sort of reading in ways that seemed to do damage to the gospel, so the Reformers in particular said, hey, let's put down some ways of how we actually interpret the Bible. And there were some other guys, Spinoza in particular, Jewish atheist, who was trying to read more analytically. So there's a number of things going on, but they came up with what they call the modern historical, literal, grammatical way of interpreting the Bible. So you look at the history, you look at the context, look at the grammar, work with the language, read it literally, don't do all fancy stuff with it. And this is very helpful. That whole pattern is super helpful. We needed that, and we must hold to it. It's very important that we do read the Bible as it is written, with the intention of the author, with grammar and history. It's very important we do that for sure. But if you take that approach to its extreme, it leads to absurdity. Here's a quote from a distinguished theologian today, Udo Schell. He's a German theologian. He says, a biblical theology is not possible because the Old Testament is silent about Jesus Christ. In a literal way, he's exactly right. The Old Testament doesn't mention Jesus Christ anywhere. And so and his rationale is simply this. He's saying, look, if we don't draw a line like that, then we get these very fantastic, crazy readings of the text that cause trouble. He's a professor of New Testament at the same university that Martin Luther used to teach at. And I think today, right now, and if I think Luther could meet this guy, I think he would throw a big, heavy German Bible at him, or more likely a big, heavy German beer keg. You know, so like, are you crazy? You know, you can't do that. Of course, the Old Testament is filled with Jesus. Jesus is that. He is the fulfillment of all of that. So then the question becomes, how can we tell what is valid prefigural reading and what is not? Is that fair? That's the question we do have, and that's what I want to look at. And I am advocating the best way to learn it, to get a feel for what is valid and what's not, is to watch how the gospel writers do it. So as you read the gospels and you see it, you get a sense, oh, this is how Mark did it. Okay, I can see what's going on. So that's what we're going to do for a little time today. I want to pause there. Any reflections so far before we dive into Mark?
I think we do this concept in our lives a lot more than we realize, and so when we talk
really
about
good.
it, when we talk about it in the context of the Bible, it's like, wow, yeah, well, it says this, but we say it means this, but we do this with our lives.
That is so
We
good.
go through something and like, it's not until years later or when you're telling someone about that time, you're like, well, I think it meant this. So we're guilty of it. For better or worse.
Yeah.
We don't actually know what's prophetic.
Yeah.
You can make a fair guess. Like the example I gave you is fairly clear. Because we know this happened and then this happened, and they meant that this was predicted. It has a lot to do with the intention of the prophet. If you can make a clear case that he intended for something. And so Micah, I look at that and go, wow, he's talking about something that is far beyond their situation. Even he knew that. So then, there's a fulfillment there.
There's textual markers all
Yeah.
the time about this being future that
Yeah.
Isaiah is full of.
Many years ago, when I was in my 20s, early 20s, which is probably where you are, long time ago, I read a book, Dwight Pentecost. He was a great scholar of Jesus, and he had this thing that there are 300 messianic prophecies, of which 200 have been fulfilled, and there are still 100 left to go. And there's a long listing of this. I loved it. I was like, wow, this is cool. And so I got totally into all of that, and slowly after I started thinking, this is crazy, man. Then I felt like a traitor, because I felt like I was a heretic. And I was reading and thinking, I don't think it means at all what you say it means. It doesn't make any sense. And then that opened my eyes to there's a wider way of, and I started learning theology for the first time. But to this day, there are people, and if you look at end times people in particular, have you ever looked at the Left Behind stuff? Which you should leave behind, obviously. but they have charts of how the end times are going to be. And Jesus is going to come and do this, and he's going to do that, and he's going to do this, I keep thinking, I hope he doesn't forget the playbook, because it's really complicated. If he makes a mistake, then we're all doomed. So this is very complicated. But that's just bizarre readings, to be honest. And part of this exercise is to figure out what's okay, and then where do we need to have some question. So in particular, I want to do two things. I want to look at how does the Old Testament teach us to read the Gospels, and how do the Gospels teach us to read the Old Testament? So let's start with one example in Mark. I'm going to do a couple examples, and I'll do more into Mark. Mark 11:15. I want to make one more comment before we head into this. about the relevance of this kind of work. So, y'all are in preparation to be pastors, is that correct? Yeah.
Not really.
Not really.
No, it's really training for the kingdom.
Okay, training for the
As
kingdom.
possible.
So you're doing kingdom work, and there are layers of it. You've got layers that there are scholars who sit around and figure out precisely what does the text say in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Greek. You know, they do all this crazy detailed work, which we totally need. It's just that none of us need to do it, unless you have a real longing for it. It's weird, arcane, hard work, and there are people who delight in it. But you and I don't need to do that. We're just glad someone's doing it, right? And then on top of that, you've got people who put together. There are about 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. Did you know that? 5,000 different manuscripts. Here's a really weird fact about these 5,000. No two of them are alike. Does that weird you out? It kind of should, actually. No two are identical. There's slight differences, a little difference here, a little difference there. And so you have scholars, Gordon Fee is one of them, you read his book, who then take all these manuscripts and assemble them and make a case for why this is the definitive text of the New Testament. And they do such a fantastic job. There's no other field in literature that has so much study as the New Testament. It's amazing the work that's being done. We can be utterly confident this is the text because of the work they've done. You know, we don't want to do that. It's mind-numbing work, but they've done it. And then we have the Bible as we get it, and then there's the work of translation from the Greek to English, and then there's a lot of debate over that as well. Fortunately, we don't have to do that. We get the ESV, the NIV. The NLT is wonderful to read, but it's just a little creative skating. But we have it. We've got some very trustworthy translations. Today, you don't need to know Greek or Hebrew to do good biblical work. We've got fantastic resources. And then you've got commentaries on top of that, right? So people read that and say, here's what it means, and give you all that kind of... those are useful to you. At that level, it starts becoming useful to us in kingdom work. The reason this stuff is important is this is, I think, at the level that we need to be confident if we're going to help other people live out this text. So you need to do this work. If you're not doing this work, then, yeah. And so then there are others who don't do that level of work, but simply listen, hey, Mike said that, I'm just going to go do it. Which is totally fine, it's totally acceptable, but that different levels of engagement. I think your level of engagement ought to be here. You ought to be doing this kind of thoughtful reading of the text. Okay, so Mark 11, 15 through 19.
He who has ears, let him hear. To what can I compare this generation?
Wait, Mark 11, right?
11. Oh, I'm in the wrong chapters. Sorry.
It's all right.
No, I'm not.
You're Matthew.
Matthew, that's why.
Same difference.
Yeah, you know. Just reading ahead. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "It is not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, they went out of the city.
Okay, why do the chief priests and scribes want to destroy him?
He's getting rid of their income.
Okay,
That's not what the text says.
It says they feared him.
if you fear him, welcome.
He was becoming more powerful than them. People are going to follow him instead of them.
The people like them.
Because he was doing bad prefiguring.
You're right, he was actually. Let's go and look at the text he's quoting. You flip to Isaiah 56. He's using 2 bits from Isaiah and Jeremiah. Isaiah 56. 6 and 7. I'll read it. And the foreigners had joined themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So Jesus is using a little bit, and many times, well, no, pretty much every time you find a little bit of something that's quoted, the intention is to go back and see the whole context. What was it coming from? So the first part that Jesus is talking about is this temple is supposed to be a place for all nations to come and worship. That's the fulfillment. At this point in the story, he is gathering everyone to come, not just the Jews. That's the intent of this place. The house of prayer is simply, the key phrase here is house of prayer for all the nations. It's a gathering together of the whole thing. And the second bit he says, but you, that was the intent, you have made it a den of robbers. And that's from Jeremiah chapter 7. Look at Jeremiah 7, and someone read from verse 1 through 14.
One through 14.
Yep.
This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house, and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe? Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trusted, the place I gave to you and your fathers.
So you see the prophetic judgment that's going on here. Den of robbers, just a little bit there, but all that he's saying is this whole thing. He's saying to the temple and to those who rule the temple, the established religious leaders, this is who you are. This is what you have done, and now judgment is coming upon you. Temple is going to be destroyed, you are going to be destroyed utterly. And this is the context they know and understand. It's not unfamiliar to them. So when they hear this, they're not just hearing house of prayer and den of robbers. They're hearing this was the intent of God. You have corrupted it, and I have come to you time and time again. You have not repented, so I'm going to bring judgment upon you. This is what he's saying. So when they hear that, and the people like what he's saying because they don't like the leaders either, then profound fear comes upon the leaders. And then they want to kill him because what he's announcing is so disruptive to what is going on. You see all that's going on in there? So three quick thoughts on the framework of the Old Testament and how it points us to the New. First, I think the Old Testament teaches us to take seriously God's word of judgment. Sweet and kind Jesus cannot just take away profound judgment that is to come. Particularly, the Old Testament is concerned, it's funny, it's not concerned about the fact that the kind of things that we focus on. It focuses a lot on, did you care for the poor? the widow, the orphan among, the alien among your midst? Did you do justice? And if not, if you shed innocent blood, judgment is coming. The second thing that the Old Testament gives us a sense of is that the purpose of God is to gather all creation together and heal it. Not just me and my friends, but all nations, all creation. Romans 8 in particular, you'll see a lot of that. So the second part of how the Old Testament shapes how we read the Gospels is the sense of wholeness. And unfortunately, when you reduce the Gospel down to simply personal sin and forgiveness, which is crucial, but if you reduce it down to just that, then you miss the scope of what God is doing. It's much, much larger. It includes personal sin and forgiveness and atonement and salvation, but then all creation groans, and God is at work to transform that. And in the Old Testament hints, if you had more time, we'd go into this, it hints that all this is going to come about in the rejection, suffering, death of someone who is God's anointed one. The son, the servant, so there's bits of that there. So those three are huge. They shape how we then read the Gospels. But then flip the question around, how do the Gospels help us read the Old Testament? Best example I can think of is in Luke 24. You know the story, Luke 24. Let's flip to that. I'll read, this is a long section, I'll read it. I'll read from verse 13 to 35. So this is, Jesus is crucified, dead, and then he's risen, and he's appeared to a couple people. But that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor of Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning. When they did not find his body, they came back saying they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us when he talked to us on the road, when he opened the scriptures to us?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Just a beautiful story. So much in it. But the profound sadness in the story, the first part is verse 21, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." This was the one we trusted in. And then he went off and got himself killed, which makes no sense. And then Jesus' response to them is not, oh, I'm so sorry you feel sad. Let me comfort you. He says, no, oh, foolish ones. Slow of heart to believe. And then he explains to them from Moses and all the prophets, explains the whole Old Testament to them in his own life. I would give anything to have been there to hear that. That would have been so cool. And here's the weirdest part. They still don't get it. They still don't get it. They're like, oh, okay, they're listening, but nothing is clear yet. It's just sort of... Another interesting thing, when he wants to explain himself to them, the risen Jesus, he doesn't do any miracles. Doesn't do some amazing sign. He doesn't tell them some new mystery from beyond the grave. He actually explains the scriptures to them. It's very powerful. So here's what the word of God has said about me. And they still don't get it.
Apart from the fact that he was risen from the dead at that particular moment. There's that little miracle going on right before your eyes.
That's right.
If you don't believe that I'm just sitting here,
right.
I'll try,
they still don't,
I'll try the Old Testament.
Right, totally. Here's the beautiful thing. It all comes together in the breaking of the bread.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's very cool. And it's really a communal meal that becomes a sacrament, For us, we have communion as a sacrament, but here it's an ordinary meal that is becoming a sacrament. And I think that there's something insightful there, that the true understanding of God's Word, it's not through some academic study. It's not even through what is said from the pulpit. It really is in ordinary community. When you sit around and talk about, connect, then your eyes are opened and something clicks. I think for all of you, you'll have moments like that. I think while I was there and we had this conversation, something just came alive with me. That's what's going on here. So three thoughts on how the Gospels teach us to read the Old Testament. One is, the Gospels teach us to read the Old Testament looking for figuration. This is a controversial statement, and there are many today who would be like, are you joking? When I read the Gospels, I think, wow, they were looking, because they had, and this leads to my second thought, they were looking in the Old Testament for prefiguration because they believed, second point, the entire Old Testament points to Jesus. If you believe the Old Testament points to him, you're going to be looking for him all over the place. And third, I would say the important insight we gain from this is that true understanding, our eyes are opened in community. This is crucial. To hear each other and say, what do you think? And sharing of that's the Spirit of God working together. Okay. I'm going to pause, and if you have any comments, great. Otherwise, I'm going to jump into more. Questions?
Just clarifying. So the first three that you noticed were, how do the Gospels actually read the Old Testament? And the second is, how do they teach us?
The first three are, how does the Old Testament shape our reading of the Gospels? And the second is, how do the Gospels then shape our reading of the Old Testament? Because they kind of work together. You need the two. In fact, if you ever have a believing Jewish friend that you want to talk these things over with, those are the two approaches you want to do. You say, here's how the Old Testament shapes how we see Jesus. They'll connect with that, because there is still an expectation of the Messiah. That reading really makes sense to them. One is coming. And then you can turn on and say, and this is how we read, how the Gospels teach us to see the Old Testament. This is why we think that Jesus is the one. And I've been there before, and that conversation can be like, oh wow, okay. You're not just blindly asserting that Jesus is the Messiah, as much as saying, here's how it all fits together. Okay, let's dive into Mark. Mark is...
Does anybody need a break?
Yeah.
No good? Okay.
Okay, this is hard work, isn't it? I mean, we're doing some hard work today. If you feel slightly lost at moments, that's totally alright. This is hard work. If you feel like it's too easy, tell me and I can
rampant.
A little bit, yeah. But it is.
Thanks for going easy on us.
No, this is hard work. It really is. As I go through it myself, I think in the times we live in, we don't do much